Welcome to the 1000 Nights and 1 Night. Now, when it was the 581st night, she said, "It hath reached me, O auspicious king, that when the old trot told the merchant the province of the scones, he cried, There is no majesty, and there is no might, save in Allah, the glorious, the great. And he repeated the saying of the Most High, Whatever evil falleth to thee, it is from thyself, and vomited till he fell sick, and repented whenas repentance availed him not. Moreover, O king, continued the second Wazir, I have heard tell of the malice of women, a tale of the lady and her 2 lovers. Once upon a time there was a man who was a sword-bearer to one of the kings, and he loved a damsel of the common sort. One day he sent his page to her with a message as of wont between them, and the lad sat down with her and toyed with her. She inclined to him and pressed him to her breast, and groped him, and kissed him, whereupon he sought carnal connection of her, and she consented. But as the 2 were thus low, the young masters knocked at the door, so she pushed the page through a trap door into an underground chamber there, and opened the door to her lord, who entered, hending sword in hand, and sat down upon her bed. Then she came up to him, and sported and toyed with him, kissing him and pressing him to her bosom, and he took her and lay with her. Presently her husband knocked at the door, and the gallant asked, Who is that? Whereto she answered, My husband. Quoth he, How shall I do? Quoth she, Draw thy sword, and stand in the vestibule, and abuse me and revile me, and when my husband comes into thee, do thou go forth and wend thy ways. He did as she bade him, and when the husband entered, he saw the king's sword-bearer standing with naked brand in hand, abusing and threatening his wife. But when the lover saw him, he was ashamed, and sheathing his scimitar went forth the house. Said the man to his wife, What means this? And she replies, O man, how blessed is the hour of thy coming! Thou hast saved a true believer from slaughter, and it happened just after this fashion. I was on the house terrace, spinning, when behold, there came up to me a youth, distracted and panting for fear of death, fleeing from yonder man, who followed upon him his hand, and he could with his drawn sword. The young man fell down before me and kissed my hands and feet, saying, O protector of thy mercy, save me from him who would slay me wronglessly. So I hid him in that underground chamber of ours, and presently in came yonder man to me, naked, brand in hand, demanding the youth. But I denied him to him, whereupon he fell to abusing and threatening me, as thou sawest. And praised be Allah who sent thee to me, for I was distraught and had none to deliver me. Well hast thou done, O woman, answered the husband. Thy reward is with Allah the Almighty, and he may abundantly requite thy good deed. Then he went to the trap door and called to the page, saying, Come forth and fear not, no harm shall befall thee. So he came out, trembling for fear, and the husband said, Be of good cheer, none shall hurt thee, condoling with him on what had befallen him, whilst the page called down blessings on his head. Then they both went forth, nor was that Corantu, nor was the page aware of that which the woman had contrived. This then, O king, said the Wazir, is one of the tricks of women. So beware lest they rely upon their words. The king was persuaded, and turned from putting his son to death. But on the 3rd day, the favorite came in to him, and kissing the ground before him, cried, O king, do me justice on thy son, and be not turned from thy purpose by thy minister's prat. For there is no good in wicked Wazirs, and be not as the king of Baghdad, who relied on the word of a certain wicked counselor of his. Quoth he, And how was that? Quoth she, There hath been told me, O auspicious and well-advised king, a tale of the king's son and the Ogress. A certain king had a son, whom he loved and favored, and exceeding favor, over all his other children. And this son said to him one day, O my father, I have a mind to fare a-coursing and a-hunting. So the king bade furnish him, and commanded one of his wazirs to bear him company, and do all the service he needed during his trip. The minister accordingly took everything that was necessary for the journey, and they set out with a retinue of eunuchs and officers and pages, and rode on sporting as they went, till they came to a green and well-grassed campaign, abounding in pasture and water and game. Here the prince turned to the minister and told him that the place pleased him, and he purposed to halt there. So they sat down in that sight, and they loosed the falcons and the lynxes and the dogs, and caught great plenty of game, whereat they rejoiced, and abode there some days in all joyance of life and its delight. Then the king's son gave the signal for departure. But as they went along, a beautiful gazelle, as if the sun rose shining from between her horns that had strayed from her mate, sprang up before the prince, whereupon his soul longed to make prize of her, and he coveted her. So he said to the Wazir, I have a mind to follow that gazelle. And the minister replied, Do what seemeth good to thee. Thereupon the prince rode single-handed after the gazelle, till he lost sight of his companions, and chased her all that day till dusk, when she took refuge in a bit of rocky ground, and darkness closed in upon him. Then he would have turned back, but knew not the way, whereat he was sore concerned, and said, There is no majesty, and there is no might, save Allah in the glorious and the great. He sat his mare all night till morning dawned in quest of relief, but found none. And when the day appeared, he fared on at hazard, fearful, famished, thirsty, and knowing not whither to wend, till it was noon, and the sun beat down upon him with a burning heat. By that time he came in sight of a great city with a massive base and lofty bulwarks, but it was ruined and desolate, nor was there any live thing therein save owl and raven. As he stood among the buildings, marvelling at their ordinance, lo, his eyes fell on a damsel, young, beautiful, and lovely, sitting under one of the city walls, wailing and weeping copious tears. So he drew nigh to her and asked, Who art thou, and who brought thee hither? She answered, I am Bint al-Tamima, daughter of al-Tiaka, king of the grey country. I went out one day to obey a call of nature, when an ifrit of the jinn snatched me up and soared with me between heaven and earth. But as he flew, there fell on him a shooting star in the form of a flame of fire, and burned him, and I dropped here, where these 3 days I have hungered and thirsted. But when I saw thee, I longed for life. And Shahrazad perceived the dawn of the day, and ceased to say her permitted say. Now, when it was the 582nd night, she said, It hath reached me, O auspicious king, that the prince, when addressed by the king, daughter of King Al-Tiaka, said to him, When I saw thee, I longed for life, was smitten with ruth and grief for her, and took her up on his courser's crupper, saying, Be of good cheer, and keep thine eyes cool and clear, for if Allah, extolled and exalted be he, restored me to my people and family, I will send thee back to thine own folk. Then he rode on, praying for deliverance, and presently the damsel said to him, O king's son, set me down that I may do an occasion under this wall. So he drew bridle, and she alighted. He waited for a long while as she hid herself behind the wall, and she came forth with the foulest of favours, which when he saw, his hair stood on end, and he quaked for fear of her, and he turned deadly pale. Then she sprang upon his steed behind him, wearing the most loathly of aspects, and presently she said to him, O king's son, what ails thee that I see thee troubled and thy favour changed? I have bethought me of somewhat that troubles me. Seek aid against it of thy father's troops and his braves. He whom I fear careth not for troops, neither can braves affright him. Aid thyself against him with thy father's monies and treasures. He whom I fear will not be satisfied with wealth. Ye hold that ye have in heaven a God who seeth and is not seen, and is omnipotent and omniscient? Yes, we have none but him. Then pray thou to him. Happily he will deliver thee from me, thine enemy. So the king's son raised his eyes to heaven, and began to pray with his whole heart, saying, O my God, I implore thy succour against that which troubleth me. Then he pointed to her with his hand, and she fell to the ground, burnt black as charred coal. Therewith he thanked Allah and praised him, and ceased not to fare forwards. And the Almighty, extolled and exalted be he, of his grace made the way easy to him, and guided him into the right road, so that he reached his own land, and came upon his father's capital, after he had despaired of life. Now all this befell by the contrivance of the Wazir, who travelled with him to the end that he might cause him to perish on the way. But Almighty Allah succoured him. And this, said the damsel, have I told thee, O king, that thou mayest know that wicked Wazirs deal not honestly by, nor counsel with sincere intent their kings. Wherefore be thou wise and ware of them in this matter. The king gave ear to her speech, and bade put his son to death. But the third Wazir came in and said to his brother ministers, I will warrant you from the king's mischief this day. And going in to him, kissed the ground between his hands, and said, O king, I am thy true counselor, and solicitous for thee and for thine estate, and indeed I rede thee the best of rede. It is that thou hasten not to slay thy son, the coolth of thine eyes, and the fruit of thy vitals. Happily his sin is but a slight slip, which this damsel hath made great to thee. And indeed I have heard tell that the people of 2 villages once destroyed one another because of a drop of honey. Asked the king, how was that? And the Wazir answered, saying, Know, O king, that I have heard this story anent. A certain hunter used to chase wild beasts in wold, and one day he came upon a grotto in the mountains, where he found a hollow full of bees' honey. So he took somewhat thereof in a water skin he had with him, and throwing it over his shoulder, carried it to the city, followed by a hunting dog, which was dear to him. He stopped at the shop of an oilman, and offered him the honey for sale, and he bought it. Then he emptied it out of the skin, that he might see it, and in the act a drop fell to the ground, whereupon the flies flocked to it, and a bird swooped down to the flies. Now the oilman had a cat, which sprang upon the bird, and the huntsman's dog, seeing that the cat sprang upon it, and slew it. Whereupon the oilman sprang upon the dog, and slew it, and the huntsman in turn sprang upon the oilman, and slew him. Now the oilman was of one village, and the huntsman of another, and when the people of the 2 places heard what had happened, they took up arms and weapons, and rose one on the other in wrath, and the 2 lines met. Nor did the sword leave to play amongst them, till there died of them much people. None knoweth their number, save Almighty Allah. And amongst other stories of the malice of women, continued the Wazir, I have heard tell, O king, one concerning the woman who made her husband sift dust. A man once gave his wife a dirham to buy rice. So she took it and went to the rice seller, who gave her the rice, and began to jest with her and ogle her, for she was dowered with beauty and loveliness, saying, Rice is not good but with sugar, which if thou wilt have come in with me for an hour. So saying, Give me sugar. She went in with him into the shop, and he won his will of her, and said to his slave, Weigh her out a dirham's worth of sugar. But he made the slave a privy sign, and the boy, taking the napkin in which was the rice, emptied it out, and put in dirt and dust in its stead, and for the sugar set stones, after which he again knotted up the napkin and left it by her. His object in doing this was that she would come to him a second time. So when she went forth of the shop, he gave her the napkin, and she take it, thinking it to have rice and sugar, and ganged her gait. But when she returned home, and setting it before her husband, went for the cooking pot, he found in it earth and stones. So as soon as she came back bringing the pot, he said to her, Did I tell thee I had aught to build, that thou bringest me earth and stones? When she saw this, she knew that the rice seller's slave had tricked her. So she said to her husband, O man, in my trouble of mind for what hath befallen me, I went to fetch the sieve, and brought the cooking pot. What hath troubled thee? Asked he. And he answered, O husband, I dropped the dirham thou gavest me in the market street, and was ashamed to search for it before the folk. Yet I grudged to lose the silver, so I gathered up the earth from the place where it fell, and brought it away, thinking to sieve it at home. Wherefore I went to fetch the sieve, but bought the cooking pot instead. Then she fetched the sieve, and gave it to her husband, saying, Do thou sift it, for thine eyes are sharper than mine. Accordingly he sat sifting the clay, till his face and beard were covered with dust, and he discovered not her trick, neither knew what had befallen her. This, then, O king, said the Wazir, is an instance of the malice of women, and consider the saying of Allah Almighty. Surely the cunning of you women is great. And again, the malice of Satan is weak in comparison with the malice of women. The king gave ear to his Wazir's speech, and was persuaded thereby, and was satisfied by what he cited of him of the signs of Allah. And the lights of good counsel arose and shone in the firmament of his understanding. And he turned from his purpose of slaying his son. But on the fourth day the favourite came in to him, weeping and wailing, and kissing the ground before him. And she said, O auspicious king, and lord of good rede, I have made plainly manifest to thee my grievance, and thou hast dealt unjustly by me, and hast forborne to avenge me on who hath wronged me, because he is thy son, and the darling of thy heart. But Allah, extolled and exalted be he, will presently succour me against him, even as he succoured the king's son against his king father's Wazir. And how was that? Asked the king. And she answered, I have heard tell, O king, a tale of the Enchanted Spring. There was once in times gone by a king who had one son and none other. And when the prince grew up to man's estate, he contracted him in marriage to another king's daughter. Now the damsel was a model of beauty and grace, and her uncle's son had sought her in wedlock of her sire, but she would none of him. So when he knew that she was to be married to another, envy and jealousy gat hold of him, and he bethought himself, and sent a noble present to the Wazir of the bridegroom's father, and much treasure, desiring him to use craft for slaying the prince, or contrive to make him leave his intent of espousing the girl, and adding, O Wazir, indeed jealousy moveth me to this, for she is my cousin. The Wazir accepted the present, and said in answer, saying, Be of good cheer, and of eyes cool and clear, for I will do all that thou hast wished. Presently the bride's father wrote to the prince, bidding him to his capital, that he might go in to his daughter. Whereupon the king his father gave him leave to wend his way thither, sending with him the bribed Wazir and 1,000 horses, besides presents and litters and tents and pavilions. The minister set out with the prince, plotting the while in his heart to do him a mischief. And when they came into the desert, he called to mind a certain spring of running water in the mountains there, called Al-Zahra, whereof whoso drank from a man became a woman. So he called a halt of the troops near the fountain, and presently mounting steed again, said to the prince, Hast thou a mind to go with me and look upon a spring of water near hand? The prince mounted, knowing not what should befall him in the future, and they rode on, unattended by any. And without stopping till they came to the spring, the prince, being thirsty, said to the Wazir, O minister, I am suffering from drought. And the other answered, Get thee down and drink of this spring. So he alighted and washed his hands and drank, when behold, he straightway became a woman. As soon as he knew what had befallen him, he cried out, and wept till he fainted away. And the Wazir came up to him as to learn what had befallen him, and cried, What aileth thee? So he told him what had happened, and the minister feigned to condole him, and weep for his affliction, saying, Allah Almighty be thy refuge in thine affliction. How came this calamity upon thee, and this great misfortune to betide thee? And we carrying thee with joy and gladness, that thou mightest go into the king's daughter. Verily now I know whither we shall go to her or not, but the rede is thine. What dost thou command me to do? Quoth the prince, Go back to my sire, and tell him what hath betided me, for I will not stir hence till this matter be removed from me, or I die in my regret. So he wrote a letter to his father, telling him what had happened, and the Wazir took it and sent out on his return to the city, leaving what troops he had with the prince, and inwardly exulting for the success of his plot. As soon as he reached the king's capital, he went in to him, and telling him what had passed, delivered the letter. The king mourned, for his son was sore mourning, and sent for the wise men and masters of esoteric science, that they might discover and explain to him this thing which had befallen his son. But none could give him an answer. Then the Wazir wrote to the lady's cousin, conveying to him the glad news of the prince's misfortune. And he, when he read the letter, rejoiced with great joy, and thought to marry the princess, and answered the minister, sending him rich presents and great store of treasures, and thanking him exceedingly. Meanwhile, the prince abode by this stream 3 days and 3 nights, eating not nor drinking, and committing himself in his strait unto Allah. Extolled and exalted be he, who disappointeth not whoso relieth on him. On the 4th night there came to him a cavalier on a bright bay steed, with a crown on his head, as he were of the sons of the kings, and said to him, Who brought thee hither, O youth? The prince told him his mishap, how he was wending to his wedding, and when the Wazir had led him to the spring, whereof he drank, and incurred what had happened, and as he spoke, his speech was broken by tears. Having heard him, the horseman pitied his case, and said, It was thy father's Wazir who cast thee into this strait, for no man alive saveth he know of this spring. Presently adding, Mount thee behind me, and come with me to my dwelling, for thou art my guest this night. Acquaint me who thou art, ere I fare with thee, quoth the prince. And quoth the other, I am a king's son of the Jann, as thou a king's son of mankind. So be of good cheer, and keep thine eyes clear of tear, for I will surely do away thy cark and care, and this is a slight thing unto me. So the prince mounted him behind the stranger, and they rode on, leaving the troops from the first of the day till midnight, when the king's son of the Jinn asked the prince, Knowest thou how many days' march we have covered in this time? Not I. We have come a full year's journey for a diligent horseman. The prince marveled at this, and said, How shall I do to return to my people? That is not thine affair, but my business. As soon as thou art quit of thy complaint, thou shalt return to thy people in less than the twinkling of an eye, for that is an easy matter to me. When the prince heard these words, he was ready to fly for excess of joy. It seemed to him as he were the dream, and he exclaimed, Glory be to him who can restore the unhappy to happiness. And Shahrazad perceived the dawn of the day, and ceased to say her permitted say. And so do I cease the telling of these tales for today, till it be morrow.